On today's show, we take a deep dive into Chet Holmgren as one of the possible 2022 NBA draft targets for the Houston Rockets. What are Chet's strengths? What are his weaknesses? What stands out about him offensively and defensively? Does Chet have true superstar potential? We're going to get into all of that and more. And should the Rockets have Chet at the top of their draft board? We're going to break it all down for you coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start.
With the second pick in the 2021 NBA Draft, the Houston Rockets select Jalen Green.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal.
I'm going to keep working. I'm going to keep getting better every day. I'm going to keep perfecting my craft. And every time I step on that floor, I'm coming.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian, and also host of Locked On NBA Mondays, as well as the founder of ClutchCityControlRoom.com. Be sure to follow along on Twitter at JT Gatlin, the show, of course, at Locked On Rockets, as well as at Clutch City CR. As always, thank you so much for making Locked On Rockets your first listen each and every day. Joining us now is Andy Patton from the Locked On Zags podcast. You can find it wherever you listen to your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to this podcast, part of the Locked On Family Network. Andy, happy to have you here on the program. You can also follow Andy on Twitter at @ScoreZagsScore. Now, Andy, today we're going to be breaking down everything that has to do with Chet Holmgren because he is one of the most intriguing prospects coming out in this year's NBA draft. And nobody knows Chet Holmgren better than you on this Locked On network. Maybe even better than some of our draft guys, just with how close you are covering the team. And where I really want to start, we're going to get into kind of just what Chet brings to the table offensively, what he brings to the table defensively, his fit, where he's mocked, like all these different things. But where I want to start is just kind of a one sentence, like give me a quick elevator pitch as to who Chet Holmgren is to you.
Yeah, that's a really great question. A good way to start it out. I think for me, Chet is a elite level rim protector with the ability to shoot 40+% from three. Like, I think that when you boil down everything else that he's capable of doing, those two things alone make him so unique.
Okay. And that in and of itself is already an incredibly enticing prospect at the NBA level. Now, there are, some concerns here and there about his frame, about his size, kind of translating into the NBA level. We're going to get into some of that, but just when you look at him, and we'll start with the offensive side and we'll slide into the defensive side of what he brings to the table in segment 2. But when you look at what Chet brings to the table offensively, just kind of walk us through just what his impact looks like on a game-by-game basis. At times, was he the go-to guy for the Zags? Was he kind of a secondary facilitator in the offense where, it would kind of run through other guys? And how does that kind of translate, do you think, to the NBA level?
I think that's one of the most interesting conversations about Chet specifically, but also just about a lot of draft prospects in particular, because the college game and the NBA game are different in a lot of ways. And Gonzaga runs more of an NBA style offense than a lot of teams, but it's still not nearly the same type of game. They're a lot different in a lot of ways. Chet came to Gonzaga more focused on trying to win a championship than he did necessarily padding his stats. He didn't do the Ben Simmons things or the Matisse Thybulle things, like guys who kind of maybe did things a little bit differently, but he is a guy who, his second game against Texas, he had 2 points, 5 rebounds. People panicked because they're like, this is, he's supposed to be taking over these kinds of games. Well, Drew Timme had 37 points in that game. They just didn't need Chet to be an elite level scorer. So we saw him get more comfortable offensively as the season went on. He started to get utilized a little bit differently. At first, his only really outside shooting was in transition, which he was lethal at. And I maintain that's going to be his best immediate skill in the NBA, is knocking down transition threes. But as the season went on, they started to use him more on, in the half court offense, started to run the offense a little bit more through him. They still did most of their stuff through Drew Timme, All-American caliber player, but he started to get a little bit more comfortable as the year went on. And he's capable of doing so many things. I think in the NBA, when the floor is spaced a little bit more, when there's, a shorter shot clock, more ability to create, I think you're going to see him do a lot more stuff that he didn't get an opportunity to do at Gonzaga. And it's not because he didn't have the skill necessarily. It's just because he wasn't asked to do that. they just didn't have the personnel to really let him do some of that stuff. But even the stuff that he did show as an offensive player, the outside shooting, the low post scoring, alley-oop dunks, he's a good rim runner. We started to see as the season went on more of the Dirk Nowitzki style fadeaway stuff that he displayed in high school but didn't do a ton of early on in his collegiate career. So I think the package is there. It's maybe not going to show up completely when he's a 19-year-old rookie, because most 19-year-old rookies don't dominate in the NBA, but the skill set is absolutely there for him to be a multi-level scorer at the next level.
I think one of those big questions, especially when you're looking at prospects like this, is right. And I try to boil it down to, are they in conjunction? Are they a play starter and a play finisher? Are they just kind of a play starter, somebody who's going to create for others, be that kind of connective tissue piece for the team? Or are they just a play finisher? So looking at kind of his offensive bag, the repertoire that he's got already under his belt, do you kind of envision him as a guy that is going to be able to at least, consistently get his, if he needs to, at the NBA level?
Not right away. I don't think he'll be able to do that right away. And part of it is because he didn't do that a lot at Gonzaga. Again, I think that was less about his inability to do that. Certainly Gonzaga played a lot of teams that he could have probably gone out and got 30 against had they really needed him to do that. But he doesn't have a ton of experience doing that. I do think that he will grow into that ability. He's so talented. His just feel for the game of basketball is so good. He does have some of that strength stuff and some of those adjustments to make from, going from college basketball and WCC basketball to the NBA is going to be an adjustment for him without a doubt. But I think right now his best impact will be more on some of the catch and shoot threes and obviously on the defensive end. But I have no doubt that his ability to grow 3 years from now, when he's still just 22 years old, but has 3 years of experience as an NBA player, I think he's going to be the kind of player who can create his own shot much better than he's going to be able to do right away.
When you look up and down at Chet's stats for the season as a whole, 14 points, almost 10 boards a game, so basically averaging a double-double. The assist numbers don't quite jump off the page, but I think that's one area that when I've watched Chet play, it does kind of stand out where he does, like, his processing speed of the game offensively feels like it's there, and I feel like that's something that maybe is a bit underrated as part of his bag right now. Is that something that you see, him being able to take advantage of, kind of playing off of his teammates to an extent? We know that there was kind of that two-man game between him and Drew Timme, and a lot of people have drawn comparisons between kind of the way that Timme plays his style of game for Gonzaga, similarly to almost like, I don't want to call Timme a poor man's Alperen Sengun because he's a college kid, right? Like that'd be a disservice to him, but kind of similar play styles between those two guys specifically. Is that something you kind of see Chet being able to take advantage of, with whichever NBA team he may find himself lined up with?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think Chet is a gifted passer. He's an incredibly cerebral basketball player. He's got a really high IQ. He plays he plays within himself. He's very intelligent, and I think he can be a good passer. The assist numbers were probably low for a variety of reasons that I don't think should be viewed too negatively about him. But I do think that we saw him. He had some turnover issues, especially early in his career. Part of that was adjusting to college referees. Part of that was him trying to make making bad passes, trying to force entry passes. Gonzaga runs a high-low offense, and it made a lot of sense for Chet to be the high guy, Drew to be the low guy, just because of their skill set. But Chet struggled for a while to figure out how to make that pass or when to just swing the ball around instead of trying to force it in there. So he'll have a bit of an adjustment period there, but at the end of the day, I think he's going to be a gifted passer just because he's got so many other skills and such a high level of understanding of the game of basketball that I think he'll figure that stuff out.
Right now, when you look at Chet's game offensively, and I feel like it's a safe bet to say that his calling card, at least immediately at the NBA level and kind of what he's being billed as, is a defensive stalwart, and we're going to get into that in a moment. But when you look at his offensive repertoire right now, what is the biggest red flag to you, or the biggest weakness in his offensive game right now that needs to be really ironed out?
I think shot creation in general and ball handling, like he showed a good, like in fast breaks, in transition, getting out. He led fast breaks frequently for Gonzaga this year, would do one crossover, go behind the back one time. And he only needs two dribbles from about just inside the half court line, and he's dunking the basketball just because of his length and size. So he was able to get out in transition that way. But if you give him the ball and ask him to create, to try to go straight line drive to the basket, he's not great at that. That's not a skill you typically ask 7'1" guys to do all that often. So criticizing him for that feels a little bit silly, because I don't think that that's necessarily something he's going to need to do. But I was on the Locked On Blazers podcast recently also talking about Chet Holmgren, and one of the things that they have needed a lot is somebody who Dame can get rid of the basketball and let somebody else create and do something else. That's not Chet's game right now. If you need somebody to do that at the top of the draft, you're probably going with the kid from Duke and Paolo Banchero, because he's got more of an ability to do that. But I think the mid-range game is going to be there. I think the fadeaway game is going to be there. His low post scoring, obviously the frame is going to need to tick up for that to be something that he can do super consistently. I don't think he's a guy that you're just going to pound the ball into down low. That wouldn't be utilizing his skill set very well as it is. But I do think that there's some creation and some ball handling stuff that he'll probably need to work on in order to really elevate his game. But again, it's not exactly the most pressing need for him at this point.
Coming up, we're going to change gears here, get into the other side of the basketball. What makes Chet such an elite prospect defensively? We're going to get there after a quick message from my friends over at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all of your betting needs and sports info. Find all the latest sports developments, including this week's Masters Championship odds, podcasts, and reviews for all the different leagues this season. And hey, this is one that you may want to try and get some money on here. Who is going to be the number one overall pick in this year's NBA draft? Right now, BetOnline has Jabari Smith Jr. as the favorite at minus 110 to be the number one overall pick. Coming in just behind Jabari, though, is Chet Holmgren at plus 160. There's a reason we're talking about Chet Holmgren so much in today's episode. And then bringing up the number 3 spot is Paolo Banchero at plus 300 to be the number one overall pick in this year's NBA draft. So head over to BetOnline, as it is your continued source for all of your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. Head to the website today. You're using a mobile device to learn more about the trends and action available to you. It's BetOnline, where the game starts. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, appreciate you for making Locked On Rockets your first listen each and every day. For your next listen, go check out the Locked On Now podcast. Nightly recaps of every NBA game with analysis from our local experts, free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Continue our conversation with Andy Patton from Locked On Zags, talking all things Chet Holmgren. Let's talk about the defensive side of the ball now, Andy, because that's going to be the area where I think you look at Chet, and that's kind of what makes him such an intriguing prospect. Arguably, best, I'll let you finish this sentence, best defensive prospect in the NBA since ?
Oh, man. I mean, it's hard because Evan Mobley wasn't that long ago, but Evan Mobley was obviously such an elite defensive prospect. I think they're so similar in a lot of ways. I think Chet absolutely has the ability to be that level of player. Before that, I mean, obviously Anthony Davis comes to mind. Chet's not on that level. I would be surprised if he was on that level right away. He could maybe develop into a player of that caliber, but those two guys definitely come to mind. But outside of that, there's not anybody else that I think definitely was a better rated defensive prospect coming out than Chet.
What specifically is Chet's best skill defensively? I mean, you can boil down defense to a lot of different areas on the floor, but what stands out the most when you look at what he brings to the table and how he impacts the game on that side of the floor?
Using his length. I think that's the biggest thing. Like, you can talk about prospects and you can say he's this tall with this amount of wingspan. And for Chet, he's 7 feet tall, 7'6" wingspan, legit on both of those things. He's got super long arms, but you have to be able to utilize that. Chet, he's not pushing a lot of people around. He also doesn't get pushed around nearly as much as people probably think that he does based on his frame, although that will change in the NBA when he faces some stronger players. But he utilizes his length so well. He can, even if he gets beat, even if a guy gets him up in the air, gets him on his tiptoes with a head fake, if they try to go around him, his ability to still reach out, still alter the shot or block the shot entirely without committing a foul is significant. I know freshmen, particularly in college basketball, often get called for a lot of fouls as they're adjusting to the game. Holmgren's ability to avoid that all season long was tremendous. It's part of what made Gonzaga's loss in the tournament so devastating, is because he did foul out of that game. And that really hurt the Zags because they were not used to playing long stretches of the game without him in, because he was so rarely in situations like that. So for me, his ability to use his length to continue to alter shots, he doesn't block every shot, nobody does, but his ability to still alter those shots, to tip shots to people. He tipped blocks to teammates a lot of the time. That's a really undervalued skill. Instead of just blocking him out of bounds where the other team gets the ball under their own hoop, that doesn't do you as much good as tipping it to a teammate and getting out in transition. So I think those are things that if you watch a lot of tape on him, you really start to see stand out how good he was at using his body and altering shots in ways that were subtle but did enough work that teams really didn't score on him in the paint very well.
Shout out to Rockets legend Hakeem Olajuwon, who kind of made that a staple of his game, denying shots, but managing to either keep the ball inbounds and just, grabbing it himself, or tipping it in the direction of a teammate to retain, or I guess control possession of the basketball, which does, really help ignite things like on the fast break, get some easy opportunities for your team. It's an underrated skill to not just be swatting everything to the fourth row like it's a volleyball match. But for a guy that doesn't necessarily, your words, not mine, block every shot, he did average 3.7 blocks per game, which is pretty impressive. So he is blocking a fair amount of shots when he gets to the rim. But Andy, when you look at him defensively, and I understand, I think you can look at a lot of different prospects, and some of them have the physical gifts where they've got the length, they've got the size, they've got the athleticism, all of that, the total package, but they don't necessarily use those gifts incredibly well. Does this, how much of this does this speak to Chet's just basketball IQ in general, and how he approaches the game defensively, be it processing the game, be it understanding where he's supposed to be on the floor at certain times, all of that?
Yeah, it goes back a lot to his ability to be coachable, to learn from the mistakes that he did make. I'm going to reference that Texas game again. The second game of Chet Holmgren's career, the game where Drew Timme scored 37 points. Chet, in that game, again, 2 points, 5 rebounds, people were freaking out. I believe the numbers were Texas attempted 56% of their shots at the rim when he was out of the game, and 15% of their shots at the rim when he was in the game. This was his second game, but his ability to immediately make an impact. But even then, I remember that game. There was times when some of the guards at Texas got into his body a little bit, caused him to bring his arm down, commit fouls that way. He learned so quickly to stop doing that, to just use his size, keep his hands up if a guy got into him. He learned when to try to take charges, when not to take charges. The NBA's rules on charges and blocks are dramatically different from college's, so he will probably have to make an adjustment to that. But again, having seen how quickly he adjusted to that at the college level, I have little doubt that by the halfway point of his rookie year, he's going to figure out when to take those charges, when to get out of the way, when to try to challenge a shot, all of that kind of stuff. I think he's so coachable. He was quick to make adjustments. He obviously has tremendous physical skills, the 7'6" wingspan. You don't teach that. That's just something that he has. But again, his ability to utilize it is better than anybody at that size, or even close to that size, that I have seen at the college level in a really long time.
The old adage, right? You can't teach height. I mean, if you've got a guy that's rolling out with a 7 foot frame and then 7'6" wingspan, that is, incredibly unique. That just doesn't grow on trees at this point in this day and age. But going to, continuing at his, kind of defensive side of things, just, you mentioned like the coachability factor there, and how much of that do you see just from a college perspective, right? Not just Chet, but just looking at individual college players. How big is that of an asset that you can like see the development and growth from Chet, that he's receptive to, any constructive criticism, feedback, what have you, to where you can actually like see the notch development from where he started with Gonzaga to where he finished the season with them?
Yeah, it's huge. And I think it speaks so well to what kind of player he could potentially be in the NBA, because he, you look at some guys in college, even in this draft class and most draft classes, were always the star. They were the star in high school. Basically, everybody in the draft was the star in high school. Most of them were probably the star in college. And then when you get to the NBA, some guys aren't. They have to take on roles. And some players adjust to that extremely well. Some players do not adjust to that extremely well. Chet is going to be a high-level role player in the NBA. He is not going to be a superstar, like leading the team in scoring. That's not the kind of player that he is. But I think he knows that. And I think that's what's so important. Again, he came to a school with the best big man in the country already on the roster. He did not have to do that. He made that decision knowing, I'm not going to lead this team in scoring. Most likely, he probably hoped that he would, but he didn't, and that's fine. And I think that kind of speaks to, he's going to get into the NBA, and most likely the team that drafts him is not going to expect him to score 20 points per game. That would be ill-advised if they were expecting that from him, but he's going to be able to come in, adjust to a role, know, hey, this is what I'm asked to do. This is what I'm going to figure out how to do this the best that I can. And based on how coachable he was in college and how much he soaked up and learned in one season, it's very clear to me that he's going to be really, really good at figuring out what is asked of me, how can I do it the best possible way. And by, the end of his first season, assuming he bulks up and gets, works on his body a little bit, he's going to be really, really good at whatever he's being asked to do.
Coming up, we'll get into Chet's projected draft stock, where the different mock drafts have him projected as to falling. What is his bustability rating? We're going to unveil that one. We're going to surprise Andy with that in this next segment after a quick message from our friends over at Built Bar. When it comes to protein bars, you've got to check out Built Bar. They are the #1 protein bar on the market. They've got so many incredible flavors to choose from. It's really, the list goes on and on. You got raspberry, strawberry, cookies and cream, mint brownie, peanut butter, salted caramel, cookies and cream, my personal favorite, coconut brownie chunk. You can't go wrong with a single flavor on their menu. It doesn't even sound like you're talking about protein bars flavors. It sounds like you're talking about like luxurious desserts from like a fancy dessert gallery somewhere. And the best part about these bars, right? Every single bar coated in 100% delicious chocolate. They're not gritty or chalky like other protein bars out there on the market. They're soft. They're easy to chew. They don't ever have like a weird consistency to them or anything. And every single bar is low cal, low sugar, high protein, high fiber. Amazing if you're on a keto diet. Amazing if you're trying to cut back a little bit, lose a little bit of weight. You could check them out. Just go to built.com and use promo code LOCK15 for 15% off your very next order of the best tasting protein bars on the market. Again, that's promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at built.com. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, appreciate you for making Locked On Rockets your first listen each and every day. For your second listen, go check out the Locked On NBA podcast. Locked On experts covering the biggest stories around the league every Monday through Friday in less than 30 minutes. I host the Monday version of Locked On NBA. Always a ton of fun. 3 interviews from around the league to get you up to speed going into the next week. Check it out wherever you listen to your podcasts. Now, Andy, this final segment here, I want to kind of go over just a couple different areas. I want to focus, on kind of the floor of Chet Holmgren, kind of the ceiling, and then we'll get into some of his, basically my de facto fun draft stat, which is the bustability rating. So let's start. I know you kind of alluded to it just now at the end of our previous segment, talking about like what Chet is going to be at the NBA level. Kind of, he's going to be a role player, right? He's going to, almost like a chameleon. Like he's going to slot in, and whatever a team asks him to do, he'll be able to do well. So how do you exactly project his floor when you look at him and, going into the NBA?
I think when you talk about his floor, it's probably it's a lower level role player. It's a backup center, backup 4 potentially would be kind of the floor for him. Obviously, there's the size factor, the injury factor, which is always everybody's floor, is that they get hurt and they can't play. But for him, assuming that's not an issue, I think physicality being a challenge for him would be something that could cause him to be closer to his floor, where maybe he's a good rim protector, but he's not an elite rim protector. He's a decent outside shooter, but his ability to score around the basket is limited because he's not strong enough. And that mid-range Dirk Nowitzki style mid-range fadeaway stuff just doesn't really show up. And so you still got yourself a guy who's a decent rim protector. And Chet, we didn't talk about this much on the defensive side. He's a good rim protector, but he's also pretty good at moving away from the basket too. I don't think he's going to get like completely smoked in pick and rolls, which is obviously the fear for every big man, is if they can't handle pick and roll switches, that's going to be a problem at the next level. He's not bad at that. He's maybe not elite at that, but he's pretty good at that. And I think he can use his length and his body. Okay. So I think his floor is probably good defensive backup center who can shoot the 3, which is still pretty darn useful. If you draft that in the top 5, you're probably a little bit disappointed, and that's understandable as well. But I think that the floor for him is still the kind of guy who, if he stays healthy, is going to have a pretty lengthy career in the NBA.
Okay. And that's a little bit more reassuring, because, and this is something that we do kind of have to discuss here, which is one of the kind of bigger, concerns with Chet is the frame, right? The size and all that. And to me, I've had concerns just personally looking at him thinking, well, if he can't fill out a little bit, if he can't, bulk up at least somewhat, then is this a guy who could find himself being played out of the NBA just because he can't simply, right? If he can't bulk up enough to deal with the 4s and 5s, and he's too big, doesn't have the lateral movement to maybe stick with some wings, at least not like 100% of the time, if he would have to be, playing as a small forward, if he can't bulk up. So you don't necessarily see his size being something that's going to, basically get him out of an NBA rotation 2 or 3 years down the line, right?
No, I don't think so. I think, again, if he does end up having to play more of a 4-3 role and play away from the rim, he's going to be adequate at that. His obviously his strongest skill set as a shot blocker is neutralized if he's not playing around the rim. But if he's playing away from the rim, he's still going to be fine enough defensively that I think he can get by. At that point, you'd certainly need the scoring to be more prominent, because otherwise he's not super playable. But I think ultimately he's got enough defensive chops, not just around the rim, but away from the rim, that if the physicality becomes an issue for him, he's still going to be playable in different roles.
And this may or may not matter with the direction that the NBA is moving these days, Andy. But I mean, do you view Chet as more of a 5 or more of a 4, especially when you look at, how he's going to play at the NBA level? Does it, again, does it even matter at this point whether he's a 4 or a 5?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it matters all that much. I think he was probably, I guess, defined as the 4 at Gonzaga because Drew Timme would have been playing the 5. But the only real difference was that Drew Timme played under the basket. Chet Holmgren played away from the basket. But then defensively, Chet Holmgren played under the basket and Drew Timme kind of didn't play defense at all. He didn't play defense away from the basket. So I'm not sure. The definition for Chet is a little bit vague. I think defensively, you're going to want to have him around the rim, which is more traditionally what your 5 would do. But offensively, he definitely plays more like a 4. Again, basketball is pretty close to positionless at this point. Mark Few has really adapted that in recent years at Gonzaga. So these guys have kind of all played all over the place. But I think he definitely has the skill set to be more of a 4, at least offensively.
Going back to one of your earlier statements talking about Chet's future at the NBA level, that he's not going to be, this like superstar caliber guy. I found that is, kind of interesting just because looking at his potential ceiling with the skill set that he has with all these variables at play, I think, at least to me, the way that I have weighted is of the top 4 prospects. Like if Chet were to hit his true ceiling, right? If he were to pan out and even hit, 85s, 90s across the board in all these different areas that he's already excelling at, I think that looks like easily the best player out of these top 4 prospects in this year's draft and potentially a franchise altering talent. My biggest thing is what is the it's so tough to throw like an arbitrary number on this, but what is the actual like percentage chance of him actually conveying and getting to that true ceiling is, I think, the big concern for a lot of people when you look at Chet this year.
Yeah, I think I definitely don't think he's going to be a superstar right away, but I do think that, again, we're talking about a really young kid coming out of college, so he could develop into something. He needs some more we talked about, he needs a little bit more in his bag offensively, or at least to prove that he can do that at that level. And I think part of it was just not seeing it very much at Gonzaga because he wasn't asked to do that. But I think it's there. It was there in high school. It was there at points during his Gonzaga career. I think that when you look at this, you look at the Palos, the Smith, all the guys at the top of the draft here, like he definitely has as high of a ceiling as those guys. I think it might take him a little longer to get into it, which just kind of depends on how patient the team who drafts him is. I think, I wouldn't be surprised at all if Paolo Banchero is a better rookie than Chet Holmgren, but 5 years from now, that conversation may look a little bit different. And that's kind of where I'm at with those 2 guys in particular. I've seen less of Jabari, so don't know him as well, but I think that's kind of where I'm at with him. I do think he does have superstar potential. I think the ability to shoot 40-something% from 3, the ability to potentially, take people off the dribble, which is something he's going to need to develop. And then of course the ability to be one of the best defensive big men in the league. If all of that comes together, it's really hard for him not to be, an all NBA caliber guy like that. That combination of things would make him very, very elite. Again, it's probably going to take him a little bit to get there, but the potential is definitely very, very high for this kid.
Now, as far as looking, kind of surveying the landscape of where Chet is kind of mocked by some of the other big outlets, we've got the Ringer draft guide actually mocking him all the way down at number 3, surprisingly. Whereas you could look at like The Athletic, who has him mocked number 1 in their most recent mock draft. And then even the Tankathon mock draft has him, mocked up all the way at number 1. Do you expect him to be a lock for one of those 1-2 spots, or do you see a possibility where he may drop down to 3 or 4?
I think I'd be surprised if he dropped to 4. That would be a bit of a shock to me. But I think 3 definitely could happen. I think Banchero, Jabari, and Jaden Ivey's in that conversation as well. There's a couple other guys who could potentially work their way to that conversation, but those are the only guys that I think have at least any level of a case over Chet Holmgren, barring, him really not impressing in workouts, which would be very, very surprising. So I think 3 is probably the lowest I think is reasonable. Like if he doesn't go in the top 3, I would feel like somebody probably made a mistake. They overthought something for some reason and got a little spooked by his frame or something like that. But I'm hard pressed to imagine that whatever of the top 4 teams there are out there that they won't have a really good reason to pick Chet Holmgren.
Selfishly now, Andy, of the teams that are kind of faced with being at the bottom of the standings this year in the NBA. You've got the Houston Rockets, obviously. Hello, that's why we're here. The Orlando Magic, the Detroit Pistons, the OKC Thunder, and then we'll throw in the Indiana Pacers, even though they're a little bit more on the. I guess I can't even say they're on the outside looking in. They've actually kind of caught up as far as the tankathon race is concerned. But do you have, selfishly, do you have a preference, or just you're looking at some of these teams and you think, you know what, I'd really like to see Chet play for X team?
From a narrative perspective, Orlando would be super, super fun. He'd be reunited with Jalen Suggs, who obviously also went to Gonzaga, and these two guys were teammates in high school. They've been friends like their whole life. So that, I think, makes a lot of sense. Orlando also has a good group of guards and could use some more help in the front court. They could use mostly everything at this point. That's why they are where they're at. But I think that, Suggs and Holmgren obviously have familiarity with each other. I think that if there is a recipe for Holmgren to have a really good rookie season, it's if he's paired with somebody who's been playing basketball with him since they were like 10 years old. I think that would absolutely help. I'm not a huge fan of Orlando's, history of developing prospects. So there's certainly some concern there for his long-term future. But I think the actual storyline would be a lot of fun. And I think Houston would be a lot of fun too. I think, this is a team with Jalen Green, with Kevin Porter. I think it would make some sense for them to have a guy like this. And I think it would be a lot of fun.
Okay. I appreciate the inclusion. I wasn't going to hold it against you if you didn't pick the Rockets. I'm just like, but you're going to earn some brownie points from Rockets fans, at least the Rockets fans that are in the, what are they even calling it? The Chia Chets, the Chet clan. Like, I don't know. There's so many nicknames for all these different like draft huddles. I find myself more so in the, we call it the Jabari jungle right now. If the Rockets were to get the number 1 overall pick, there's also the Bankero bus and the Ivy Leaguers, which is probably the best name out of all 4. But this is the kind of the moment of truth here, Andy, because we got to get to the bustability rating. And I just want your thoughts on, again, it's kind of a combination, right? For those who don't remember from all the draft work that we did last season, but bustability rating to me is essentially the combination of a player's floor and ceiling and the, realistic outcome of where you think they're going to land at the NBA level. So if you will, Andy, what do you kind of grade Chet Holmgren as far as his bustability score?
So as I understand it, a 1 would be like unbustable. Like they're going to be, yeah. So I'm probably like 3-ish, somewhere in there, maybe 4. I think that there's like the ceiling for Chet Holmgren, as we talked about, is super, super high. And I think it's definitely possible he doesn't quite reach that, but I don't think that he's going to bottom out super low. I don't think he's a guy who's going to be out of the league in a couple of years. I don't think he's going to be a guy that whichever team drafts him is going to be talking about like, was this the worst pick in franchise history? Is this one of the worst? I don't think that's going to happen with Chet. I think there's a reasonable possibility that he ends up being a good role player, maybe, a starting center that's like your team's 3rd or 4th best player. And certainly there's an avenue where a lot of fans are disappointed in that. And I think that that's reasonable, but I don't know that I would consider that like a huge bust necessarily. I think he's more likely to reach to be a high level starter, one of the best centers in the league, maybe not a full on superstar, but I think the odds of him being at least a really good starter in the NBA are pretty high. So I think that the odds of him busting are pretty low. I'll give him a 3-ish in that regard, especially because he already has the mentality of a player who's willing to not necessarily need the spotlight, need to score 20 a night. He already is kind of adapted to that. So I think his ability to, hey, I'm not going to, maybe he realizes that I'm not going to be that kind of guy, but I can adapt to a role. I can still be a useful player. So I think he's going to be that at a minimum. And so even if he doesn't reach that potential, I think he's still going to be a good player.
Last thing here, Andy, and I do appreciate all your time, all the time that you've given us here today. But for people who want to check out a little bit more on Chet Holmgren, maybe view some footage, what's probably the best game of the Zags season for them to go check out to see him at his peak when he is at his best? And conversely, what's also probably the game that they can go check out to see some, unfortunately, some lowlights, right? Where, the game where he kind of struggled the most, where you can kind of see both ends of the spectrum with Chet.
Yeah, well, I know very distinctly he had a phenomenal game against University of San Diego. It was the first time those two teams played each other. Particularly, he had a phenomenal 93 seconds where he scored 11 points, had 2 blocks and a rebound in literally a minute and a half. It was extraordinary, jaw-dropping basketball. Sean Farnham, who was on the call for that game, just started laughing while calling the game because it was just such an incredible thing to see. He struggled against Alabama in the non-conference in December, which was a game that everybody for Gonzaga struggled, quite frankly. He also struggled in the Memphis game and the Arkansas game, the last 2 games of the season. I think there was partly some fatigue, partly some just big physical guys. He struggled offensively against Memphis, I should say. Defensively, he held Jalen Duren, who's another, potential lottery pick. Jalen Duren had 3 points and 4 fouls in that game. So he did some pretty good damage against him. But definitely the Arkansas game, the last game of the season for the Zags, he fouled out. He didn't have a point in the first half. That was a game where you can kind of see some of the struggles for him and kind of how he also adjusted well. I think he had 7 points in the first 5 minutes of the second half after not scoring in the first half. And then he fouled out, but he's still, you kind of see him pick himself up and figure out how to adjust, which is, I think, a skill that's going to serve him really well.
Andy, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here with me on Locked On Rockets. It'll be really interesting to see if you have either swayed the thought process of some Rockets fans out there, if you've maybe reinforced those who were already pulling for Chet Holmgren, or potentially people who were on the Chet Holmgren hype train have now abandoned it. They're like, you know what, Andy, I heard Andy talk about Chet, and now I'm off the Holmgren bus. But with that, Andy, do me a favor, let everybody know where they can track you down at.
Yeah, absolutely. You can follow me on Twitter at ScoreZagsScore. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Zags as well. Jackson, really appreciate you having me on the show, man.
Absolutely. Thanks again for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure. That is going to do it for today's episode. If you haven't done so yet, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to your podcast. That's Apple, Spotify, Google, the brand new Odyssey app, free and available on all platforms. You can also check us out on YouTube. Just go to YouTube, search Locked On Rockets, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Let me know how you feel about Chet Holmgren after this episode. Has Andy changed your opinions at all, be it for the better or for the worse regarding Chet Holmgren? Let us know in the comments. I do read each and every one of those every single day. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. We look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.